So this is late 2007. We were bigger than Twitter, and we were the second largest online platform, and was still like 1.5 people.
Welcome to the Eric Ries Show. Today, I'm joined by Siqi Chen, a serial entrepreneur and OG lean startup supporter, whose journey has taken him from the wild west of early Facebook games, you may remember Mafia with friends, to navigating the challenges of leading a company through the pandemic. In our discussion, we dive into the deep lessons of entrepreneurship that Siqi has learned along the way. We really get into the transformative power of self-awareness for founders, how understanding defaults, embracing vulnerability, and fostering trust can make or break a company's culture. I hope you'll especially find Siqi's reflections on building trust, not just as a value, but as a daily practice, eye-opening. We also explore the fascinating paradox of success, how the very traits and strategies that help us thrive early on can hold us back if we don't evolve. Siqi shares candid stories of his own growth and missteps, offering timeless advice for anyone building something new. This episode is packed with insights about the human side of entrepreneurship. Whether you're a founder, leader, or just curious about what it takes to grow, I think you'll get a lot out of this conversation with Siqi Chen. Well, first of all, Siqi Chen, it's great to have you on the show. It's fun to talk about stuff after all these years. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me. It's so great to be here.
All right, Siqi, a lot of people now, of course, know you as the founder and CEO of Runway, which we're going to talk about. But to me, you will always be the guy who created Mafia and Friends for Sale.
Oh, man. That's unbelievable.
So take me way back, because I vividly remember playing Mafia for the first time. And I think a lot of people listening now are probably too young to remember. We're getting old a little bit. So this was like one of the first viral social games on Facebook.
I didn't even know you played that game.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it was so addictive. Yeah.
I've heard of
I was an early adopter. I was in those like groups of people who were like trading friend accounts. It ruined my Facebook friends list because I had all these random people on there because we were like coordinating our Mafia playing. Yeah, it was crazy.
Oh my God. I had no idea. Okay.
So because like social gaming like had its moment in the sun, and now it's kind of become so ubiquitous people don't even think about it as a category anymore. But like, take me back to that time, because Facebook was already quite the phenomenon. But nobody really understood at first what they were talking about with Facebook platform, and they were going to bring developers on. It was going to be this thing. Just how did you first hear about Facebook platform, and like when did you get the idea to try making a game for Facebook?
So I moved to the city in mid 2007, like early May, to work for a company called PowerSet, which I think you might have heard of. It was eventually became the search engine team that did a lot of early Bing. And so it was a natural language search startup. Great people. I think I was working with Chris Wanstroth at TPW, who were eventually, 6 months later founded GitHub. And then also Luke from Crowdflower, and now Weights and Biases, just like a really great group of people. And somehow I was invited to this party on the weekend when I first moved there. This is like a week later. And it's a lot of people from Y Combinator, who are founders in YC, which I wasn't a part of, but I really wanted to be a part of. And we were playing a board game. We were playing a game of diplomacy. And I thought it was really fun. And the diplomacy takes like something like an hour or two per turn. So we were playing for the whole day. We maybe like got through half the game. And I just thought, wouldn't it be fun if someone like built a really social game on Facebook's newly announced platform? F8 was the Facebook event, and was when they announced the developer platform. And I thought this could be fun because you want to play with friends, and now you can have access to your friends for the first time. And that was a real innovation, right? Like before the platform, if you wanted to bootstrap a new social product, you had to get access to people's friends, and they had to install your app. And apps didn't really exist back then either, nor did the ability to get to your address book. And so the idea of a platform on the web where you can access your existing friend network, friend graph on a platform was really revolutionary at the time. I also wasn't smart enough to actually build diplomacy. I never built a Rails app before. So I thought, what was a game that is also social, but involved your friends, also social, but was a game, and that was easy to make. And I thought of Mafia, werewolf, you just like refresh the page. Built that, and that kind of blew up really quickly. And internally at PowerSet, I started becoming, I was called FB Mills was my nickname for FB Millionaire because we're printing money on the ads. And then a bunch of people reached out, investors. And I don't think I've ever told this story, but Max Levchin and Keith Rabois reached out, and they were at Slide at the time. And, I hope Keith doesn't mind telling me the story. He's actually an investor company now, but this is 2007. I think it's old enough to tell.
Yeah. This is all old news now.
This is all old news. They reached out, and they're like, "I should hang out." I said, "Okay." And they were running a company called Slide at the time. I think at the time, probably the biggest developer of applications on the platform. They were early on MySpace. And I was so excited to meet Max Levchin. And so
you knew who they were from their PayPal days. Yeah.
Oh, of course. I mean, I was, a year or two out of school. I was a huge tech nerd, read all the Paul Graham articles, and this is Max Levchin, and Keith Rabois. So we met with them, and I remember talking to them. They wanted to acquire the app, actually acquire my friend's app, Superpoke. Nikhil, who built Superpoke, I work with in San Diego. And they're like, yeah, we acquired this company. We'd be interested in figuring out, how much you want for your app. And I said, $2 million. And they just kind of laughed me out of the room. And what I remember immediately is they were like, well, good thing there's a recession coming up so we can buy all these companies for cheap. I'm like, oh man, this is not the way, the way I thought this meeting was going to go.
Man, I've had that meeting too. I know just what you're talking about too.
Yeah. I thought about that for the next 10, 12 years until I talked to Keith again. I was like, will you invest in my company? And now we're friends. But at the time I was like, wow, these people are aggressive.
Yeah. They always say never meet your idols. This is why.
Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Vanta. If you're a startup founder, then product market fit is obviously your number one priority. But to land bigger customers, you also need security compliance. And obtaining your SOC 2 or ISO 27001 certification can open those big doors. But they take time and energy, pulling you away from building and shipping. That's where Vanta comes in. Vanta is the all-in-one compliance solution helping startups get audit ready and build a strong security foundation quickly and painlessly. Through the platform, access trusted experts to build your program, auditors to get you through audits quickly, and a marketplace for essentials like pen testing. So, whether you're closing your first deal or gearing up for growth, Vanta makes compliance easy. Join over 8,000 companies, including many Y Combinator and Techstars startups who trust Vanta. Simplify compliance and get $1,000 off at vanta.com/Eric. That's VANTA.com/Eric. We actually first met in the context of the very early days of Lean Startup. My memory is you were an early super fan of the ideas and an early evangelist.
Yeah, startuplessonslearned.com.
Yeah.
It was extremely, it was very life-changing for me. I actually referenced, I went to that. You think you have, I don't know if it's not, I don't know if it's .com still there, but there's an archive somewhere.
Yeah.
So I went back to 5 Whys, shared with the team last week,
Oh, wow. That's a classic. Wow. Thank you.
Yeah. 5 Whys is classic. I love that. And that, I think that was a thing that also got me on a Deming's kick too.
Mm-hmm.
It got me into the whole, and then product development flow. So yeah. You and Paul Graham between you and Paul Graham were probably the two of the most influential intellectual thinkers in my life. So
that's high praise.
Big fan.
I don't know if you have any reflections from that time. It was such, people are coming into entrepreneurship today when Lean Startup is now almost the conventional wisdom that people have to buck against. That was a time when it actually seemed new and revolutionary. Any reflections on what it was like back then, or just what do you remember about encountering those ideas for the first time?
The body of knowledge wasn't there. Startups seemed like an activity. And it was the first time where you could read something and it felt grounded in real practice, and it was systematic. Mm-hmm. And I think that ended up being, the double-edged sword, where I read it as this is a process here. It is extremely scientific. And then people took the process as the process.
I know.
And I think that's, also any great product, right? The thing that it takes you to a place won't get you there. That's what made it successful. People looked at it as I can do this. I just need to do these things. Right. And I think that's for me also, when I was looking at this, I was like, this is so useful and this is so clarifying. But I also need to figure out how to like reconcile this with other things that are also important. And I actually couldn't wasn't always successful. So, I would go back to these individual muscles. I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that. Right. But yeah, at the time it was very much a revelation.
Thank you for saying so. I appreciate it. Yeah, those were fun days.
Yeah.
How much time elapsed between when you first moved to Silicon Valley and when you were having that meeting with Max Levchin?
6 months.
Yeah. That's what people don't understand about when we talk about how, San Francisco is a place where innovation, we're like a company town, innovation is the company business, like the city's business. That's what happens here. The density of those networks is extremely high, and people can go from total outsider to having these incredible experiences in an incredibly short time. That's part of its strength.
It is unbelievable. Yeah, I think about that and I talk about that all the time. So yeah, I was 2 years out of school. I literally knew nobody. I had negative $30,000 in my bank account, and moved here for a job. And then you build something and everybody wants to hang out with you. And I think Naval Ravikant said this, right? Like you don't have to worry about your network by going out to play at different conferences and events. If you build something interesting, your network will come to you.
Yeah.
And it will come to you very quickly if you're do the right things in the right place. And San Francisco for sure is the right place. 6 months later, I was meeting Max Levchin. 7 months later, I was running a venture-backed company. It's still to this day, pretty unbelievable to me. It's a very special place.
So tell us about that company.
So that company was called Serious Business. It's the opposite of fun games, which is what we did. And we built another app after Mafia. And the idea was, okay, now that this is working, let's build something a little bit more ambitious and interesting. And I always really admired what Facebook was doing. So Facebook described their mission at the time. It wasn't making the world more open and connected. That was the mission, I think, post the newsfeed. Before, they were mapping a world social graph or something to that effect. And I thought that was amazing, right? Like every other platform was really about creating these relationships online, like LiveJournal, MySpace, or meeting with these like random friends who you may have never met under pseudonyms. And their belief was that the value is in the real world social networks. And they oriented their product around that. And I thought, well, be a nerd, and this is not how I would recommend you think about how to start a company, but I thought, okay, well, if this is a social graph, in graph theory, there's nodes and edges, and they have the nodes, the relationships. Oh, they have the edges, and they have the nodes, but you can have weights to the edges. Like some people are more famous than others, some relationships are more important than others. So how do we like figure out what the weights should be? Maybe there'll be something interesting there. Because some people have 5,000 friends and they're sort of unsorted. And I thought, okay, what if you made like the friendships a scarce resource and then you had to trade them? So that became an app called Friends for Sale, where people could basically trade people around as cards. And that was extremely popular, like way more popular than Mafia was. I think it was at a time. So this is late 2007. We were bigger than Twitter, and we were the second largest online platform, and was still like 1.5 people, myself and my part-time co-founder, who eventually joined us, my co-founder, Alex, who I know he eventually ran product at Reddit. Mm-hmm. So that blew up, and that's one of the things that led a bunch of investors to reach out. Investors, as it turns out, in Silicon Valley are good at their jobs, and their job is to do one thing, find out what is blowing up and what's working, and they immediately reach out. It is uncanny, right? When something starts working, you don't even have to go to reach out.
It's such a strange feeling.
They come to you immediately. It is remarkable. And so one of those investors was Jeremy Liu.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He was our first investor.
Of course. Actually, what's funny was very on brand for him, of course.
Yeah. Naval Ravikant actually wrote my first term sheet.
Wow.
So he was running a fund called Hitforge at the time. He just left ePinions. And I pitched him, and Jeremy was willing to pay a slightly higher price. So
Jeremy got the deal.
Yeah. So we raised $5 million ever. I think that was the only round we ever raised because I didn't really know anything about raising. I thought, well, raise a thing, and I guess you hire people and try to make money. It was a pretty formative experience for me. It's actually also a contributor to what I'm doing now. I never thought of myself as any kind of business person. And what led me to that first company was I just wanted to build something cool that was going to be popular. I thought that's what you're supposed to do. And I did build something at least popular, and it did make some money. But my identity was a technical product person. And I think in large part still is. And I remember having a Harvard MBA on a team and having a part-time CFO and getting these spreadsheets. And I was tasked with building this business. And I really didn't know the first thing about it. And so that really will give you imposter syndrome in a pretty significant way. And I think I'm probably not the only founder who feels this way. Okay, I'm going to just build something and hopefully the business works. But as it turns out, the business really does matter part of it, right? And when investors invest in a company, you are expected to build a business. And we don't really think about it in that way by default. I think at least I did it when I was like really young. And so we ran that company about 2 years, and we were profitable. We had like 30 or some employees, but the space was massive, and we weren't growing explosively the way many of our competitors were. Playdom, Zynga, and there was one other company I forgot the name of, but Playfish.
Oh yeah,
was the other one, right? Playfish was the other one. And these are all run by pretty experienced operators who kind of knew what we were doing. And I just wanted to like build cool games and hopefully it'll make money. I had no idea about how to like really build a team, scale a team, how to scale a business. And so we were eventually acquired by Zynga about, this is 2010. So that'll be about 2.5 years later.
It's interesting you talk about being kind of the technical builder type. And I feel like there's people fall into these traps. One of them, of course, is just what you're describing, like really neglecting the business side of it and just saying, well, you know, I'm just building a product. And part of what we spend a lot of time when we're teaching people entrepreneurship is just to remind them that you're building a company that built a product. And if you think of the company as like a machine or a superorganism that needs to be attended to in the same way the product does, then you know that you could be a lot happier. But there's a lot of technical folks who don't want to do that. But the other trap I see people fall into is they're like, oh, I've heard that you need a business co-founder to start my company. So they like either go around like waiting to find the magical business co-founder, or even worse, they kind of like get hitched up to the first like seemingly businessy person that they meet. And they do a company where like they have no idea what the business person does, but they're nominally in charge and they're like very, very confused. And I feel like what's interesting is that like all these forms of kind of not being willing to engage with like, what am I actually doing? Like, what is it to build a company? Gets you in trouble. And for a lot of folks, you know, sometimes being an outsider, being new to function can be an advantage because you really think clearly. You think from first principles. You don't just borrow a bunch of best practices. You force yourself to learn. So I always try to teach technical entrepreneurs like just to be open to this idea that this is important and not to let anybody tell them what to do, but not neglect it either, but like really go into it the same way you first, encountered computer programming. Like you weren't born knowing how to do it. You gradually mastered it over time. And I'm curious, like, you've gone through that journey yourself, and I'm sure, you've invested in so many cool companies. You've worked with so many founders. Like you have so many, I'm sure now you have clients who are founders who are in that same state, who are using Runway to try to, to figure out like, what is it that I have? Like I run this business, but what does that mean? What advice do you give people who are like trying to figure out how to get into that, but aren't sure if they have the capacity to do it?
20 years later, when I look back, for me, at least, it just took a lot of time. That's a hard thing because, the way I think about this is a lot of founders like me, we are successful initially as founders because we have some kind of technical skill developed pretty young. You got into computers, you're a nerd. And that kind of correlates with, well, it's because the social world, interacting with people seems harder, at least for some people. It was for me. And so you go to Silicon Valley and you're a good engineer, and all of a sudden, wow, you have status and power in some form, right? Like at least people are willing to fund you to have a company, which is like, this is wild. So here's this thing you're really good at, and you got rewarded for it. And you also know that the other stuff, humans are squishy and you've never been really good at it. And so you have an aversion to focusing on that. And your instinct is going to be focusing on the things that you were good at, which is, this is, in my case, technical design, product. I was a nerd about that. But it was extremely helpful. And it's something I learned at Zynga, the phrase, treat the process as a product, treat the organization as a product. And that mental model is extremely helpful, but also limited, because it is a helpful mental model in that you're creating a machine too, but also the components of the machine are not exactly transistors. They're people with feelings and ambitions and different experiences. And the way you communicate, interface, is not quite a terminal. And figuring out how to do that is not just a skill. I think it requires a level of self-awareness about you, who you are, how you communicate, what are the things that make you feel things, and how do people perceive them. And I probably didn't really examine that as deeply as I should. And I really haven't made a huge amount of progress until fairly recently on this. But it is extremely important. And I think as a start, treating it as a process is actually a pretty good thing. But my meta message is being aware of what your defaults and preferences are and what your background is probably the highest leverage and most important thing. Because without it, you're just like, I'm a good engineer. I've been successful. I'm going to focus on that. And that's going to get you to where you want to go.
A lot of people treat this as like a special parable about being a technical person, or people, being on the autism spectrum and then trying to learn to deal with people, or, there's all these people, there's all kind of like famous stories about, highly introverted technical people having to then go into business. But to me, it's a much more general point about entrepreneurship that no matter what you're good at, whatever the thing is that got you into entrepreneurship, that's what made it possible for you to start a company or to join an early stage company or to be valuable in a team context. But if the startup, only unsuccessful startups have stasis, if you're staying the same, you're dead. So you're growing, it's changing. And you go through these phases where the thing that was making you successful yesterday is no longer making you successful today. Except you don't find that out until months later. So it's like, hi, congratulations, you've been promoted to a new job. But your promotion was effective 6 months ago and you're already failing in the new job. And guess what? It requires you to abandon the things that you were good at before and learn this whole new skill. That's it's a very painful way to live. And to voluntarily go into a career where you do that over and over again, I think you hit the nail right on the head. Requires a lot of self-awareness. Just you got to be paying attention to is what was working for me before still working for me now.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in, can you dive in a little more into the Zynga? Zynga's culture has been very influential in the Valley now, because a lot of Zynga people have gone on to do really cool stuff, and they were real pioneers in many of the techniques that are very common now, both in product building and online marketing. But I think also this culture of kind of a real extreme process orientation has become more popular in recent years. So talk a little bit about the processes, the product, and maybe tell us a story. Can you give an example of both the strengths of that, but then you're talking about the limitations of it that it can kind of only take you so far. So how far can it take you? And then when did you start to realize you were up against the limits of where it could go?
It can take you pretty far in the right environment, right? And when I look back at a high level, the Facebook platform was a very specific type of ecosystem. And Zynga was the most well adapted to it. And when you are very well adapted to one environment, when environment changes, it doesn't work that well most of the time. And so Facebook was an environment where it really rewards people who were extremely analytical and aggressive at optimizing distribution channels. It was all about virality. And Zynga was extraordinary at it. And the really interesting thing that I haven't really seen anywhere else is when you look at the background of most of the product team, they actually intentionally hired from investment banking. they really thought of the product and the way to manage product as like, we're going to make the numbers go up. Mm-hmm. And they were so good at it. I joined the company, and I am, being an engineer, I felt like I was good at making numbers go up too. But I also really appreciated the product and I really want to make fun things, which is interesting because that was actually the rationale for the acquisition. They identified through analysis that one of the things that was correlated with retention in their products and games was real social. People actually interacting, not just, clicking on the buttons. And they looked at some of the games we made as like, oh, these are real social games. We should acquire this team because they know how to do this. So I thought that was great. When I joined, though, the culture was like very much not that. And I also, when I left, because it's kind of the company version of what got you here isn't going to get you there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They built a multi-billion-dollar company, by far the most successful company in space, by being the best at uncovering every hidden trick and every new mechanic and aggressively learning from the ecosystem. One of my most memorable things was talking to Mark Pincus shortly after acquisition. And I was just finished running this company that he just bought. And the thing I was worried about is there's so much competition. The barrier to entry seems really low. It's easy to get distribution. So how do you compete? So I posed that question to him. And he said, I want there to be more competition. Competition is great. I was, okay, I'm like, why? He's like, it's free R&D. And that just floored me. This is someone who is had such absolute confidence in his ability to execute that it doesn't matter. And I think about that a lot. So there were, so the product management team, very good at what we do. We shared learnings widely throughout the company. So I joined as a director of product in one studio. And then eventually, actually one of the co-founders, also funny story, also long enough that I'm going to tell this. I never told this publicly, but I reported to one of the co-founders and head of product, Eric Ries, and he actually stopped going to work and decided to become a ninja one day. True story. And so I ended up running product for about 6 months that I moved to China. And so it was a really fun experience. We got to be in all of the studio product review meetings or disseminating learnings. And it was working. And when it stopped working is when the mobile transition happened.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most successful companies, and that was founded later, is Supercell, right? Clash of Clans. And they had a completely different culture. It was all about the gameplay and the fun. And of course, you support it with data. And Zynga had, I think, a more difficult time adjusting to that culture.
Yeah,
I think they eventually got there, but it's very hard to change culture. But they also were extremely competent and smart to know that they had to, and eventually did get there, if not through acquisitions, then through hiring different people and processes change. And this happened many years after I left. But yeah, it is for me a lesson in you need to have both. Right? There is something artistic and creative and personal about a great product. And when you're data driven and you are process driven, that is an incredible full force multiplier. That is a combination. And when you have either too much of one or the other, the results either don't become good in the first place or not particularly sustainable.
Yeah, that's interesting that you put it that way. See, I've always thought of the lesson of Zynga a little bit different. To me, what started out as kind of a purpose-driven thing that was about actually having fun and creating this social experience, really satisfying social experience for the customer, eventually became really just about making it as addictive as possible. And so a lot of I remember the later stages of the social gaming era, a lot of those games were so exploitative. It was very close to being in a casino. You're not actually really even enjoying. You just can't stop playing because they've found all those levers. And it's interesting to me that for whatever reason, Facebook had cultivated an ecosystem where that was really the apogee of competitiveness for that that platform, and that Apple didn't do that. So, I think it's partly by design, but partly by the technical accident of just how things are different. When Zynga had to go make the mobile transition, to me, I remember feeling like they've lost my trust as their customer. Like, I don't really, I like at a certain point, I was like, I don't actually think they're trying for me to have a good time. I'm just, it's interesting you mentioned investment banking. I'm just a commodity product that's being bought and sold here for the benefit of them and their shareholders. And I'm curious, you saw that from the inside. Is that right?
The thing that resonated with me is like, when you said it's not really about making you happy, that's when I got that feeling, it's like the day I decided I want to leave. Mm-hmm. I realized that the way I could maximize my own incentives as a PM, if I wanted to juice revenue, is just literally put up a paywall. It was like, pay us $10, we're going to set your farm on fire. Yeah. And that probably would have been our highest revenue day ever. I think, for me, I think it's a lesson in incentives, though. What Mark Pincus, when he was running company, really talked about is this idea of bold beats and delivering fun to our players. He really cared. And he would talk about it a lot. It's not what anyone would do. And it's because the incentives were, you have every Thursday or Wednesday or whatever day it was, you have to go into a room with Mark and the head of product and a bunch of people and show your numbers. And if your numbers were up that week, you're going to have a bad time. Zynga was notorious in org where like product managers break down crying in these meetings. I was in these meetings. I was actually running part of it. I wasn't the person making people cry, just to be clear.
No, but it was a system that had that.
It was a system. And I remember sharing this presentation, and you mentioned trust. I said, the thing about the way we operate is when you are so data-driven, you're optimizing for two things, not just the numbers. You're optimizing for things that are easy to measure and quick to measure. Trust is not one of those things. Retention tends also not to be one of those things. Something could juice retention in a week, 2 weeks, even a month, but you could be losing it in a 3 to 6 month time span. Mm-hmm. And so those things are kind of hard to measure. And when our incentives are so short term, we're going to not get great long-term results. But nobody cared because, again, the entire system was oriented around, well, what are we going to do next week? Because who cares what's going to happen like in a month from now or 2 months from now? It's going to die anyway. And I think part of this too is like this idea that these products do have an inherent limited lifespan. And it was run as such. And I always thought that was like maybe short-sighted. Like Clash of Clans is still going. Right. And there are like very few, I think Zynga Poker maybe is only one of the few games that are still running today. Like Original Farmville is like one of the most popular games of all time. They shut it down like about 5 to 6 years ago. I think it could have gone on longer if it wasn't run in that particular way. That's my opinion.
Yeah, well, as you say, these mobile studios are the proof of concept that it clearly is possible. I think that illustrates some of the most important entrepreneurial lessons that I've learned in my career. I mean, first of all, and I know Mark, and I like him, and I admire what he built at Zynga.
Me too.
But I really remember that just like the look on his face, the anguish. I've seen this in so many founders where it's like you have this intention to build this organization that exists for this purpose that you really care about. And it's not failure that deters you from that. It really is success that becomes the problem. You get addicted to the treadmill. You build this system where everyone is just, number go up machine. And, you lose control of it. You're telling people to do one thing, but the system and the incentives cause them to do something else. There's like a gravitational attraction to doing the wrong thing. And once you let that happen, and in particular, we live in a world where like the stock market and investors, and there's a lot of pressure on companies to transmit those values. It's not random that companies always wind up in this exploitative local maximum, because obviously there's a lot of external incentive also pulling us there. And at a certain point, like, yes, you're the CEO. Yes, I mean, he had super voting control of the company. Like he was the one nominally in control. And yet once you lose control of the beast, it takes on this life of its own. And then the point, obviously, this has been a recurring theme in these conversations about trustworthiness as an asset, that we don't hold it on our balance sheet. So we're not custodians of it. We don't see how valuable it is. And I just think about, every time a company does something exploitative, like, right, some startup somewhere is high-fiving, being like, all right, you just created a competitive opening for us, like by being an a-hole like that. That's amazing. Like, thank you so much for doing that. And you do that over and over again, and you create these massive openings for competitors to show up and say like, oh, great. Yes, you have the superior execution, but people don't trust what you say anymore. So when we come along with a new value proposition and we say, hey, listen, switch to mobile, switch to Clash of Clans, like be our long-term partner. And you're like, no, stick with Farmville. It's like, people are kind of glad to like have the, like, I remember that feeling of like relief. Like, I'm finally off the treadmill. Thank you for getting me off the treadmill of Farmville and those games. It actually, like, towards the end, it was physically painful to play them.
Yeah.
And I just like, I think companies just really undervalue that, like, that long-term thinking, that trustworthiness, like, culture.
I feel like that has some intersection with why there's such attraction to this idea of a founder-led company. And I think the public markets play into this, right? Like, there's something about having the will and the moral authority to look for something longer term, something like more mission and vision driven than the next quarter or the next month. And the difficulty is having the conversation is hard. It's almost like it's very difficult to be good at these conversations. And if you're good, how do you argue with, well, here is what's going to happen next week or next month? Because you're going to lose it every time. And you almost need someone's like, I'm just not going to argue with anyone about this.
Right. I have the moral authority.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It requires really understanding that businesses have a purpose and that, like, the superorganism, the entity that you're creating, it has its own moral compass. And it's funny, I was talking to a founder, tell me if this relate to this, because sometimes, it can be a bit of a cliche. Silicon Valley companies are always talking about how they're trying to change the world, but then you're like, change the world by, improving database performance by 3% or whatever. And it's like, haha, it's like a running punchline on so many shows and movies about Silicon Valley. Fair. And first of all, fair enough. But I was talking to a founder who was like, listen, I don't care. I don't go in for all this stakeholder nonsense. I don't care about DEI, ESG, whatever. I just want to build a great company that builds great products. And I want it to be like the greatest place for product engineering people that they've ever worked in their life. That's all I care about. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Is it your experience in life that companies kind of naturally, automatically settle into that culture, as if you don't do anything? He's like, absolutely not. Every company I've ever worked for that's sucked. And he's like going on and on and on about it. I was like, so would you say that this organization you're building right now, it has a purpose to create these things? And he's like, yeah, obviously, like, look at me like such an idiot. I'm like, okay, but that's not the same as number go up. So which is it? Like, does your company have a purpose, or does it just exist to enrich your shareholders? And he was like, well, come on, man, what are we talking about? Of course it has a purpose. He'd gone from like, I don't go in for all this stakeholder nonsense to like, yeah, obviously, of course it has a purpose. I'm like, okay, so what steps are we going to take to protect that purpose as the company grows so that you stay true to it? And he looked at me like, what are you talking about? I was like, okay, like, welcome. So you talk about this levels to this, like, it's a level of understanding to be like, oh, I'm building a company, not just a product. And it's a level of understanding to be like, oh, I should probably think about like doing like building systems and incentives to like try to have my management system be about actually accomplishing the mission. Like, it's like, it's not so obvious when you say it out loud, but when you're in the heat of the battle, that's hard. And there's like another level after that, which is like, how do I build a superorganism? It's like intentionally designed to accomplish the thing that I want to accomplish, even though investors might want something different. And even though employees, like, even though there's all these other people who have different views, and there is this gravity that pulls. And I wanted to take you kind of into the past a little bit, because of course, like, you seems to me like, and I'm very happy to be an investor in Runway. Thank you, for letting me be on the journey with you. I feel like you've taken a lot of those lessons and poured them into this new venture. And so, like, I'm curious, as you like, obviously we should tell people who are listening now, like, what is Runway, and give a bit of the origin story of it. But I want you to tell the story with this in mind, because I want to understand. You've done some extraordinary things at Runway that to me do not seem like an accident. They seem highly relevant. But I think from these past experiences, but I think a lot of people might look at it and say, wait a minute, he was in social gaming, he did this VR thing, like, but now, why is he running a finance company? Seems strange to me. But to me, it seems really natural. So I want to make sure that you tell the story, like, so in a way that people who haven't followed your career all these years, I want them to be able to understand how is it that these lessons about company building and what really matters in entrepreneurship led to Runway?
I feel really seen because I've talked to a lot of people, and it's the first time someone said it feels natural. I kind of feel that too. So Runway is a FP&A platform. And if you're not...
Explain what that is for
you
the
probably
kids.
have no idea what I just said.
Yeah.
But people have generally heard of the term finance, either in investment banking or in a finance department if we're at a company. And it seems mysterious and somewhat bean countery, spreadsheets, numbers. So I should probably explain what finance is in the as I understand it in the context of the company. So finance basically has two components. The first is backwards looking. They measure and they track and report out what's happened financially to the company. How much money was spent, where was it spent, and how much money was made as a result of that investment. And so that's what you would describe as accounting. Increasingly, the other half of finance is becoming more important as companies become more complex. And that's the forward-looking part of finance. So that's about forecasting where the company is going to be in 12 months, how many employees we're going to have, what's the revenue, what are the plans of the company, how do they feed into those business outcomes. And what drives these forecasts are spreadsheets and financial models. And the way to think about these models as an engineer or as a game person, the thing that makes the most sense to me is imagine like you're playing Roller Coaster Tycoon or Civilization. There's an underlying game engine. And when you do things, it simulates what's going to happen. And it shows it to you. And that's what makes the game fun. You interact with it. That's literally what a model does, right? It lets you plug in, I'm going to hire 10 more engineers, spend $1 million more in marketing, improve the product in this way. And here's what we think is going to happen to our financial outcomes. If you're a product person, you've probably already done this. If you might have created a growth model at some point where you're modeling retention and morality and trying to figure out how much money you're going to make, how many users you have. It's literally the same thing, except with different units. Instead of users, it's dollars. So that's the way I think about this. And inside these companies, as a company scales, this problem becomes more and more complex, more and more time consuming. So the first thing you have to do is you have to pull in a bunch of data from all these different data sources. And you need to have that so you can have a starting point to know where to simulate from. What is the starting state of your simulation? Then you have to figure out how the simulation works, which is probably the biggest problem because the way any particular person in the company, including a finance person, thinks this game works or the marketing works is going to be different from how the marketing person actually thinks it works. So you have to like program the logic, and you're basically engineering simulation, and the understanding of the logic is not particularly sound because it's not the same person. And then you simulate it, and then you have to get all this information and plans and intent from all the different parts of the company. And once you have that, you have to make some decisions as a team or as a CEO on where you're going to go. And then you have to share all of that with the entire team. So all that becomes really, really complicated. And generally, spreadsheets are not particularly understandable by anyone other than the one person who made that model in the first place. So the idea is, what if we made like something that felt as good as Notion and Figma, where everyone can actually look at this, create their own plans, connect the way the marketing department and engineering department and product department sees the real business into one place so that everyone has the same point of view. And we think it can be done by better software. And the better software part is really important because, when I think about the thing that's actually really motivating about what we're working on is I think there's a direct line between what we're working on and the earliest forms of technology. Like, I think the earliest forms of technology is language, right? And language is what allowed us to communicate intent to people within earshot, right? We yell at people within earshot, we form tribes, and then language transformed into speech, and into writing. And writing allowed us to coordinate people outside of earshot and allowed us to form civilizations and cultures. And so when I think about the latest forms of information technology, from email to spreadsheets, they're all ways of us offloading more and more complicated thoughts so that we can coordinate with people. And business is probably like one of the most complicated, complex things that we do with each other as human beings. And the tools haven't kept up in terms of how easy it is for us to understand and work with people.
Yeah.
And that is, at the end of the day, what Runway is about.
Where did you get the idea for Runway?
It was directly from the experience of having to lay off 90% of Sandbox, 95% Sandbox after the pandemic hit. So we're scenario planning with Andreessen on how long COVID was going to last. We're creating these spreadsheets. And about 30 minutes after I laid myself off, I was talking to our CFO. We hired from Netflix, really experienced, great person. And I said, we could have used something better, right? Because Figma is a thing now, Notion is a thing now. Surely someone has already made something really great here that we could have used. We were just too lazy to do it. I was like, no, this is it. I said, but isn't there, I heard of a thing called Anaplan. Is that a thing? I said, nobody likes using that. So that's how I got started. And I often say, and I really do think this, like Figma, and if it wasn't for Figma, Notion, Runway really wouldn't exist. Mm. When I look at those products and how good the abstractions are and how accessible they've made very complicated things, like I think components of Figma is one of the more brilliant design decisions I've ever seen in a product, because what it did is it unconsciously, like subtly made the software engineering principles of polymorphism inheritance usable to a designer without any kind of engineering experience, right? You can create a component that represents a button and have it be a class, and you can change that one button and all the buttons change. That's incredible. And so I thought, okay, if you can, what is proven is that if you can increase the bar and push forward the efficient frontier, just trade off between accessibility and power in products if you design the abstractions in the right way. And I thought there is going to be an opportunity to do the same for business to make it a lot more accessible to both people inside of finance and outside of finance. The interesting thing about the products in this space is that when you talk to finance people, because the products on the cloud are so heavy and slow, they still actually do their modeling forecasting in a spreadsheet. Yeah, and they end up just copying and pasting the outcomes into this platform. And at that point, why are you even paying for it anymore? And I actually was asking myself that question for quite a while, and I found an answer from someone from the inside in one of these companies, which I won't name. But as it turns out, everything that I said about the opportunity around like we should make this accessible and the different parts of the company should look at the same thing is not a new observation. It's a pretty obvious one, especially when you've been working on a product for like 10, 20 years, right? What happens is that you can build an extremely valuable business, and this product is actually much easier to build by building a workflow tool. So it's pretty time consuming to just get budget requests out to the different department leads and get it back. It's not that hard to build. You could build a lot less. And just by saving very high paid executives a few hours of time every quarter, that's already an immensely valuable product. But in order to build the product that actually gets people to use it, to model, you have to build a tool for thought. And the bar for execution, design, engineering is like way higher. And so you're just not doing that because you're already so invested in this other type of product. And that's just not the product I want to build.
I know this pain very well. I've spent a lot of time learning the finance function myself, and I've worked with huge companies in their finance departments doing all kinds of organizational transformations. And you're giving PTSD to a time when I was working with a company where the quarterly reconciliation, so this is the process of generating the financial reports that needed to be, that ultimately roll up to become the quarterly report that the company puts out under penalty of securities fraud, and perjury every quarter. The executives have to sign, if they're lying, they go to prison. That process was taking 1% of the company's total workforce 1 month every quarter to generate this report. It was just an incredible waste of time and energy. And the company had paid for all these tools, and they must have had 25 different FP&A tools all over the different companies. But of course, the different divisions didn't use the same tool. Every finance person doing their own thing. And I remember when we were doing the customer discovery to try to figure out how this could be fixed, I was like, we got to drill down to the actual end users of these tools, both the people that generate the reports and the people that consume them, what's going on. And in almost every case, if you fly out to some regional office, far from headquarters, and you get the actual finance person who's entering numbers into the tool, and you say, how did you generate these numbers? And they were like, oh, I got my abacus and my spreadsheet, And I did it myself. It's like, this tool sucks. So of course I did it myself in my like side thing. And then I had to like backport all my conclusions into this crappy tool to like then send them up in the pneumatic tube up to headquarters. You're like, wait a minute, this multinational company, like people go to prison if these reports are not accurate. And people who are signing the report have no idea how they were generated. They were generated by some guy, some girl, in the middle of nowhere doing their own custom process. Now multiply that times the thousands and thousands and thousands of people working on this thing. You're like, oh my God, what a mess. But I think you really put your finger right on it, which is like all they had were workflow tools. If the workflow doesn't completely match the actual lived workflow, it's funny how similar it is to the social gaming thing we're talking about, right? Like if it's not the real social, then it's fake. It doesn't work. Then people are like pretending to be something that they're not, instead of if you actually like improve people's mental capacity by giving them the right abstractions.
I got to tell you the story.
Yeah.
What you said about people don't know what people end users are doing.
Yeah.
So I've talked to probably like 100 at least users of the incumbent products, and no one has said they liked it. And everyone, except for one person, said, we're going to do modeling outside of the platform. Like that's how we actually do it. This one person was a CEO of a Fortune 100 company. And he was like, no, it actually was great. And I think the way we implemented like must have been really good. Actually, I'll introduce you to the person who implemented it. So like, oh my God, I need to learn how to do this. I talked to him. It's like, yeah, so I was told this is actually a really good experience, which is really surprising to me. I gave him the context, like, no, he said, no, it was awful. He just never had to deal with it. And I just never saw it. But let me tell you how terrible it was. We ended up...
we hide it away from the CEO so he doesn't have to know. Yeah.
Yeah. Which tells you something about like how these companies can still be successful, right? Like, the people buying them are not the people using them. And the expectations for user experience has gotten up, and the way we buy products is pretty different. So I think those are all some of the reasons why we thought Runway might have been a good idea.
I can't remember who to credit this aphorism to. Basically, someone was saying there's two kinds of companies. There's a kind of company where the CEO can email an employee and ask a question and they get an answer. And then there's a kind of a company where the CEO emails somebody in the company and that spawns like a committee. Well, the employee has to be like, okay, how do I need to like workshop my answer to reply to the CEO? So they go talk to their friends about like, okay, I got this question. How should I do it? All the people who might be implicated in the answer are like given a chance to weigh in to like soften the edges or whatever. And there's like a process for answering the question. And what's funny is from the CEO's perspective, they can't tell the difference. In both cases, they send an email and they get a reply. So they are like, oh, great, I sent this guy an email. I got it. And they don't have no idea that like 20 hours of work, that half the team was up all night the night before preparing to draft this email. And half the time the CEO was like, I wasn't even that interested in the answer anyway. Like, oh, it's just an idle question. And they're like, they have no idea how much churn is being caused. And you layer that down. That's happening as companies get bigger. You have layer upon layer of like people basically obfuscating the truth from the people who are the decision makers. And it goes back to what you're saying about the incentive design. That's what they think the people they work for want.
Yeah. Incentives rule everything around us.
Talk a bit about the values of Runway, because that's something I found really striking. I get a lot of investor updates from a lot of companies, and most of them are pretty boring. But you guys, it's interesting, like way that you've approached it, and I'm curious, especially like this question of like, to me, I kind of feel like underlying all these things is like a bedrock commitment to the actual truth. Like the truth of data, of course, is one truth, but also like the truth of the lived experience of the customer is another kind of truth that's really important. So as you guys have grown, how have you managed to stay true to that?
So our values actually changed. The values that we have, we refreshed earlier this year, and that was an investor update. So our current values is give a shit, create clarity, build trust, raise the bar. What we started with is, it was accelerate, create magic, trust by default. I think a few more. It's been a while, but the fact that I can't remember them is telling.
Yeah. Well, they weren't concrete in the way that the new values are.
Yeah. So when we started a company, like most founders, we said we need to figure out what our values are. So I just wrote down what I thought my values were and what our values should be. And I said, let some feedback on these values. People give some feedback. It's like, cool, these are our values. When we were operating, a lot of people couldn't figure out what creating magic was, what it meant, how to make decisions off of that. What does it even mean? And for me, there's like deeply held intuition, subconscious beliefs that makes sense to me, And when people don't get it, I felt frustrated. I'm like, what do you mean? Just make it magical, make it really nice, like make it delightful. It's so obvious. And probably that's my biggest learning, is that the most obvious things to me, my default reaction is to feel frustration when it's not obvious to other people. But when I dug deeper, I realized that when I feel these things, it's really a disconnect between like how much I was able to communicate my context and my assumptions to other people. And because they were obvious to me in the first place, it's something that I never thought I would even need to communicate. And also because of that, because I never had to practice communication, it was actually pretty difficult to communicate it when I realized I did need to communicate. I wouldn't even know how to put it into words. And these are also the things that give people superpowers, right? Like when it's so natively, deeply ingrained in you, it becomes obvious. You assume it's obvious to everyone, but it's not. And so being able to identify that and pull it out and make it explicit is really powerful, and how you align a team better. But anyway, going back to the values, what happened is they were not universally understood, but the real symptom was people didn't naturally mention them day to day.
Mm-hmm.
And over the course of the first couple of years, I thought we were operating, well, at times not well, but at times like we thought we were operating really well. We were proud of the way we were operating. And the values weren't being used. And so we thought we need to have values, and they should be something that people use. And the current set of values came from an exercise where we actually just examined what people were saying when they operated. So what were people saying? They were saying, we raised the bar here. They were saying, yeah, everyone seems to really give a shit, and it's important to create clarity, and we have to build trust. And so when we put together this new set of values, the reason why we knew it was going to work, and it did work, is we were already saying them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an element of values where, you're just like trying to be aspirational, and you're saying like, this is what we're about. But as it's to be maybe obvious, like values is really about what you do, right? What you already do. And that is a function of like who you hired and how you communicate and how you operate. And ideally, if you're operating well, the values are good. And so capturing that was pretty educational. And it seems to really resonate, not just with the team, but outside the team, because they feel real, because they are real. We didn't make them up.
When you talk about them, you have the authenticity of a team that really does it. People don't understand that values really are about reifying what the company already does. And actually, people think aspirational values are great, but they're terrible because they create this mismatch between what the company says that it wants and what it actually wants. And that gives employees the impression that the company values hypocrisy. It's like, oh, I got it. I should do the bad thing, but pretend to be doing something good. Like, yes, sir, whatever it takes. Back to the incentive question. That's what it takes to get ahead here. That's what I'll do. But I think when people hear that, and especially people who are still trying to figure this out, it sounds like, wait a minute, if all we're doing is writing down what we're already doing, aren't we going to experience cultural drift? Like as the company gets worse and worse and worse, we'll just refresh our values to update that. Like now our value is to not give a shit anymore. Now our value is to erode trust. Like that, that can't be right. And I think there's something people have a hard time understanding, which is that when you have a high functioning team, and frankly, most people have never actually worked in a high functioning team. So I don't really know what it's like. It's like when you read books about flow state as an individual person, if you've never actually experienced the flow state, you're like, what are they talking about? But then when you've lived it, it's like, I would never trade it. Like that's a high we're all chasing. And the work equivalent of that, I think, is you're in a high performance team. People don't appreciate how much high performance teams are much more aligned with people's like natural goals and desires. like most people actually want to do a good job. Most people actually do give a shit like naturally about things. And if they feel like they're in a place where their contributions are valued, where they're fully seen, where they can be themselves, where they're connected to a higher purpose that they view as personally meaningful, we don't have to tell them what to do. Values are not like making sure they believe that stuff. You should only hire people that already believe that stuff.
Yes.
Our goal is to protect the negative cultural drift that comes from all this gravity that pulls us aside. So although it might sound like we're just writing down whatever the team is already doing, the key is to first get the company into a high performance state, then document what are the beliefs that got us there, and then use that as a kind of a reminder to like help people resist the siren call of short-term thinking or, whatever the external pressures that you're dealing with. And of course, I have a particular interest in the value of building trust because I've been on this trust kick, and it's come up in almost every conversation I've had with a successful person on this podcast. They talk about the importance of trustworthiness. So I wonder if you could like zoom in on that as like an example of how you have helped the team understand what that means concretely, because it's easy to say build trust, but then, people are like, yeah, you say build trust, but then if I have a chance to, stab someone in the back for $1, I should do it. You're like, no, it's not what we mean. So explain kind of how do you help people understand what that means, and maybe tell a story of a time where you had to build up the reservoir of trust by sacrificing a short-term opportunity or kind of standing up for something that you knew was right, even though it was difficult.
So the best way I can explain it is if you contrast that with the old incarnation of values. Old incarnation was trust by default.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why that didn't resonate is it puts the act of trust on the giver versus this idea that trust needs to be built. It's interrelational between two people actively. And I think I was the thing that was most impactful to me in my understanding of how to build trust was joining Leaders in Tech, this program run by Joe Greenstein. And it's basically touchy-feely from Stanford GBS, but in the form of a class or a couple of
We'll put a link to touchy-feely at the GSB for those that have no idea what we're talking about. It's a really cool program.
It's life-changing for me. I think most people who went through it will tell you it's life-changing. But one of the things I learned about trust in that program is this idea that there's these like two tracks in when people communicate. There's a content track and there's a relationship track. And the content track is when you talk about facts and like greetings, hey, hello, how's the project? And the relationship track is only filled when you are disclosing emotions. How do I currently feel is what's called level 4 of the 4 levels of communication. And then how do I feel about you right now is level 5 of the 5 levels of communication. And level 4 and level 5 is where the relationship track gets filled. And so the way to build trust is to put myself out there and tell someone how I'm feeling in a moment, and ideally how I'm feeling about them in the moment. And I've always tried to actually avoid this, right? Like if I don't feel good about a person, I don't want to say that. And that's, I think, a natural human instinct, right? You don't want to offend them. You don't want to be disliked. You don't want them to dislike you for some reason if if you think they think that you don't like them. But what actually happens, at least in my experience, is the opposite. Mm-hmm. And I had this exact experience where I was working with someone on the team and we were talking through some problem. And I just shared what I was feeling about this person in a moment for the first time. And we've been working together a couple of years. And they said to me, we've been working together a couple of years. This is the first time I feel like I can actually trust you. And I thought we had a good relationship. But when you're feeling or thinking someone about a person and you're not expressing it, people know, they can sense it. And that can fester. And so I think building trust, probably the biggest component of building trust is being open about how you feel. And, people call that feedback. I think feedback is a good way of explaining it. But feedback is almost like you're trying to ask someone to change something.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, it takes the focus off yourself and how you're feeling.
Yeah, telling people how what you feel for their benefit. And that's an element of like giving and almost like sacrificing, risk-taking that people reward. And it's when reciprocated, it's actually what builds trust. And so we actually talk about that internally quite a bit. And this is going to sound, to me, even if you rewind 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, like the most ridiculous thing. But literally at the start of our leadership meeting, we go around and we just talk about what we were feeling in a moment right now, like emotionally. And it's been amazing to increase and build trust within a leadership team.
Exactly. I can totally relate to that. I think a lot of engineers have this problem that you grow up with a real resistance to this kind of domain of topics. And look, there's a lot of woo-woo stuff out there that's not great. But at the end of the day, you're building a company, and the company is composed of human beings. We are the cells and organs of this superorganism. And how we're doing, ultimately, the company, all it has is the decisions, the quality of the decisions that the humans make. And there's nothing else really of any value to it. Yeah. So attending to that is really smart.
Going back to the values for just a second, I had a thought, which is, I think values are downstream of purpose and meaning of the company, like why you exist. And, Lulu Chung had this great article in Pirate Wires. I often think about this idea that most people think about narrative as a thing you do on the side. You have engineering, product design, marketing, and then you have a story that you tell your customers and your investors. But a different mental model is that the story is the center of your company, and it starts with a CEO or founder or a leader, and it goes to the leadership team, it goes to the wider team, it goes to your customers, and then the wider world. I think that's how you end up with something congruent. And I actually think values are downstream of that. So what I really enjoy is when I think about our values at Runway, they also reflect why we're doing it. They literally reflect what the product is supposed to do, right? They're supposed to, it's helping people give a shit about the business. It's creating clarity within it. It's creating more trust within the different parts of the business so that the performance of the business, the bar can be raised. When you have that kind of congruence, it becomes really powerful and multiplicative. And so having alignment around purpose is, I think, how you get the other things right.
I appreciate you saying that. I completely agree. And I think people underestimate how valuable that is. Especially then as you get bigger, you wind up, a lot of companies, there's a separate department that's responsible for the employment brand, separate person doing internal employee comms, external comms, and marketing and brand is different, investor relations. You have all these different functions that are all trying to tell the story of the company. And I remember sitting with a bunch of employees of a certain company I shall not name. We were in the bar after doing a lean startup workshop and, kind of chatting about how it went that day. And the TV's on in the back of the bar. And one of the company's own commercials comes on about how much the company cares. It was one of those we care commercials and what a great place it is to work and how great they are for the environment or whatever. And all the people in the bar started laughing. They're like, what company are they talking about? The same people that, are ruthlessly squeezing me to make the quarter go up. They also care. It's they, give me a break. And it's just that incoherence. It's impossible to build any kind of trust if you don't have it. And then, as you say, you can be as coherent as you want, but if the thing that you are coherent to is fundamentally exploitative, then you can't build trust there either. So yeah, exactly right. The hierarchy's got to be purpose, story. What are we actually trying to accomplish? How does that flow into our practices, including our values? And then how do customers in the outside world perceive what we're doing?
Yeah, and hire people who believe in that story, right? If you hire people who want to be there for that reason, I think the values will follow from that.
So tell us the story. What is the purpose of Runway?
Yeah, the purpose of Runway is to make business accessible, understandable to everyone. We think, the stated art for business is that business is complicated and you don't really need to understand business because we have extremely well-paid executives and finance people who understand this. But we think in order for everyone, including finance people and executives, to do their jobs well, it's important for everybody to care about how the business works. When you think about a finance person, the frustration is nobody cares because people don't understand it, right? They're perceived to be these bean counters who send out these empty spreadsheets to different department heads every quarter, and they get ignored. So then they have to ping them on Slack. And what they actually do is probably one of the most strategic things in the entire company, which is to have a model of the business and forecast where it's going so that you can grow faster and not run out of money. And that deep disconnection comes from the rest of the company not understanding the business, and because the tools aren't good enough for that understanding to happen. And we think if we can achieve that mission, that's deeply meaningful to people, because most people work somewhere in a business. And having an understanding of how it works and what your impact is gives you purpose and fulfillment even in the work that you do. So that's why we exist. And there are people who are like, that is a mission that I want to be a part of. There's customers actually who want to be part of that mission, which is really interesting. Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, we're 4 years old, and to get this off the ground, it's a pretty wide surface area, and you've been following along our journey. We had to build a lot of software, and it just floors me how even early on in our journey, we had these early design partners and the product wasn't very good, didn't do very much. The companies we work with will still say, it's totally fine. We just really believe in what you're doing. Mm-hmm. It's like when you have that, then you get so much more momentum that you didn't necessarily earn in the product.
Oh, yeah.
But it means you hit on something. And so we really tried to double down on that.
It's all these people arguing about what is an MVP, like really fundamentally don't understand what we're trying to do here. Like when you have that connection with the customer, it's no longer about what features you have or you don't have, but like, are they enlisted with you on the mission to accomplish this thing? And it takes experimentation out of the range of the like banking style exploitation, like we were talking about before, where I'm tricking you, I'm giving you something less than what you expected, or the thing is defective, but it's okay, because it takes it out of that domain to be like, look, I am transparently and honestly sharing with you what we actually have here and trying to make it better. Will you help me do that for both of our benefits? Like we both get something out of it. No one's being exploited. We're both better off because we both believe the world would be better off if this mission was accomplished.
I had a breakthrough in my own brain, like over the last 2 weeks, related to the lean startup. And we were updating our company strategy after launch. And I never felt like I was a person who was good at strategy at any time. It just seemed like a waste of time. And as I'm working a strategy, the team would keep on giving me feedback, and I was getting increasingly frustrated. I was like, just tell me what you want to hear. Right. Yeah. And their feedback was very specific. It was like a strategy would be about like where we play, who we're serving. And I'm like, I'm doing that. And what I realized is that as I was doing it, for some reason, the way my brain was wired, I could not disassociate that with a product, with a answer. And it got to a point where as I'm writing down in the strategy, I had to repeat to myself, don't think about a product, don't think about a product, don't think about a product. And that was completely invisible to me until like really recently. And so I think there's a lot of maybe product type of people who are founders who are very good at inventing products. And they read something like Lean Startup, it's like, well, I just have to do these things and that's complete. But actually like the invisible way your brain is wired, where like, as you're thinking about like which target segment, and you just cannot disassociate with a particular product idea, that is a signal that you need to work harder on a strategy and try to disassociate it so that you can understand the customer pains better, understand the customers better, so that you can actually achieve the vision that you want.
Exactly. So that you can achieve the vision. And it's funny because I've obviously spent a lot of time in argument with people who teach entrepreneurship differently than we do in Lean Startup. They do it top down, from like first pick your strategy, and then from the strategy pick your business segment. And the last thing you do after you've done all this analysis is you figure out what product to create. And there's nothing wrong with doing it that way. But most of the entrepreneurs that I've met in my life, they have no idea what you can run them through that exercise, and they have no idea what you're talking about, because by the time they become an entrepreneur, they've already formed in their mind that they want to build this product. They have this fantasy about this vision being realized. And so if you want to teach them strategy, you can't be like start over from a blank slate and do that. Plus that involves throwing away your whole life experience, which is not actually that good. What we want to do is help you abstract from the thing that you already know for sure, that you already connect to find out like, of the many commitments you made in your little fantasy story that you told yourself, which ones are true? In your fantasy, there are no trade-offs. There's never any trade-offs in a fantasy. You get everything. Everything works out just the way you want. But in real life, you have to choose. Should it be low cost or high cost? Should it be widely accessible or more elite? Should it be, is the press going to love it or the press going to hate it? Are regulators going to think it's great? Or are you going to be more risky? Like there's all these trade-offs you have to make. And a business strategy guy listening to our conversation would be like, I know that's why we started with the strategy, dummy. Like, come on. Yeah. But if you are naturally aligned with the product, if the customer, the vision, the thing, the building of the thing is what got you into it in the first place.
Yeah.
We have to abstract up from that. We can't go down from abstract principles.
What is sort of dysfunctional about some of this is that we treat this as a zero sum. And I think that's the zeitgeist, right? It's been, well, it's either be customer driven, lean startup, or be very vision driven. And these two like don't go together.
No, it's so wrong.
And it's, what you want and what we need to, I think, say more about is the instincts and intuition and the vision of a founder, I think is basically never wrong. I think there's always like some deep truth about it that is correct. And what needs to happen to get there is you have to be 100% flexible on the path it takes for you to get there, driven by the grooves of reality that you learn. And we treat it as like, oh, it's one or the other. And that's just like, it's not true. It's not how it works.
Yeah, that synthesis is something that you can see how you've gotten to that understanding over the course of your career, but it's something that's it's often very hard-won wisdom. And it's always interesting to me how people fight about it. And it's like, well, how about instead of fighting about it, you just do it?
Yeah.
And then you after you found out what really works, come back and tell me what works, and we'll these are whatever works. Something that works better, we'll gladly adopt it and make it the standard.
Then you too can learn how it works after 20 years of trying.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it goes back to your point about something could be so obvious to you, but how do you teach it to people? It's actually really difficult.
It is.
And that's not just an academic question. Companies have to be able to express their values to their own employees in a way that they understand. So you can't just be like, this is obvious. Balance these two irreconcilable things. Good luck. That's not going to get it done.
True.
Going back to what you were talking about, the purpose of Runway, that one of the things that really struck me, I've always felt like it's basically a human right to know whether the job you're doing matters to anybody except your boss. Like that's something that actually a lot of people don't have that. It's actually very uncommon. Most people are like, I just do what I'm told. I do my job and I trust that it's all going to work out. And if you ask people like, first of all, do you know how your job affects the business? Sales guy will be able to answer real easy. He's like, I make money for the business. Some people, it's very obvious. There's a large number of jobs where people are like, I don't know, I think I kind of help make the machine work better somehow. And you're like, does it really matter? But more importantly, you ask people like, look, you said to me, and especially see in the rising generations, they have a really strong belief that your work should make the world a better place, like non-ironically, like it's just, you should be aligned with good values. And you should do good work in the world. Like, okay, is your job doing that? And they're like, I don't know. If you don't know the numbers, like if you literally don't understand what your job creates for the company, you don't understand how the incentives are aligned and what it's all about. You just like, well, my company says we're a good place. We're doing good stuff in the world. And then like the biggest cynics and radicals I ever meet are people who got betrayed on that promise, right? They didn't really understand what their job was. They didn't really understand what the company did. And then they found out later that actually the whole company exists to do this like really malign thing. And it's really bad. And I just feel like bringing people that like sense of transparency and direct connection to like, what is this work really about is incredibly important. So thank you for working on that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the most fun thing I've ever worked on and certainly the most fulfilling. And I think the team feels that way too.
You've been a really outspoken advocate for using AI to accelerate the business, and you share all kinds of cool tricks. Like I remember you were sharing about we had Wade Foster on from Zapier, and we were talking about how Zapier. I think you talked about use that for lead qualification, and you're integrating that with AI. Just share a little bit, because that's like probably the number one question I get from people now in business is like, how should I be using these tools? And most people are not getting a lot of value out of them actually, which I think is really interesting. Like they're seeing the cool demos and like, how come I can't have that for me? I feel like you've had a really practical approach to like making these tools genuinely useful for the business. It's kind of very on brand for what you guys are trying to do with that purpose. So share a little bit about what you found helpful, and just do you have an advice for anybody who wants to get more value out of the AI tools?
One of the things I think about a lot is how to keep the company small. Companies just are less fun when they're big. And I think we live at a time where the rate of AI improvement is fast enough where you can increase the leverage of the team through the increasing capabilities of AI. So we always thought about how we can do that. And the model capabilities, they do a lot more than people think, but also for the most sci-fi use cases, they're not quite there yet. It's not a full-on agent that can write code or talk to customers today yet. I think it's getting pretty close. But a way we think about internally is, Joel Spolsky in the late 2000s observed that Google engineers uses the Bayesian filter the same way as a Microsoft engineer will use the if statement. And that's kind of how we think about a good use of AI today. You can turn unstructured data and make structured decisions about them. So in the case of lead qualification, we're basically saying, here's a bunch of unstructured data, make a determination in the same way a human would. And it's really good at that. If you're a recruiting firm and you get 100,000 applications and you need to rank them, AI is good at that. It can give you a score, and it'll let you sort it within some margin of accuracy. So I think there's a lot you can do to create leverage today. And so the way we think about it is we don't really comment about all the SaaS tools you use to drive your business. You just kind of use them. We don't talk about how our products are driven by JavaScript and AWS. You just kind of use them. I think that's the right way to think about AI. It's a useful tool, and you still have to build a good product, understand your customer problems, and there's another tool in your toolbox for it to use. It's going to be increasingly powerful all the time. But that's one principle that we think about. The other principle is this idea of agency and proactiveness. The default way people interact with most AI products today, unless you're an engineer, is by having this a conversation with almost this person. But what's missing there is most people actually don't know what AI can do and what questions you can ask. And so if you can be proactive inside workflows to make workflows faster and better, that's one way of solving that problem. And the second problem is it doesn't know a whole lot about you or the company. And so you can find ways to give it the context. Then it becomes more useful. So, those are the three general high-level ideas that we think about when we use Runway internally and in the product.
The other thing that's really notable about Runway is your use of design to get attention and generate excitement for a product that I think a lot of people would assume has to be really boring. So when you guys did your initial launch, I remember that first website you designed with our friends at Reform Collective, with the boarding pass motif and the airline thing, that was extremely cool. That was one of the best I'd ever seen. And then you recently did this really, I don't even know how to explain the swag approach you had with this launch with the timed lock. I remember, I was lucky enough to receive one, and I just, literally for those that didn't see this on social media, this was blowing up everywhere in my little world. They sent a bag that had a physical lock on it and with a countdown timer on it, like a Mission Impossible, mission. This bag will self-destruct at this time, and the lock was coded to time with the midnight of the day when the launch was going to happen, and you couldn't find out what it was until that one. It was just an extremely clever way of generating attention, again, for a product where, people will be how can you launch a spreadsheet and make it exciting? That's really difficult. So I just talk a little bit about what it was like to try to engineer those viral moments, and more more seriously, how have you used design, to help people understand what the company's all about?
Yeah, I think that is the example I was thinking about when I was talking about it's downstream of purpose and values. We, as a company, we exist because we think these things should be understandable to people. And so whether you're a finance person or a CEO or engineer, you're all people. And the branding and the way we market reflects that. The way we think about how we market is we market it as a consumer product. Because it's built for people to use. So that's one thing. And the other thing we value is raising the bar and giving a shit. And when we do something, we don't want to do it because it's the expedient thing to do that everyone does. We believe that if you can do something new and interesting and creative and put the effort in, that the results are 20% better. It can be 10x better, 100x better. And that means we're willing to put more time into it. And so there is a price that we're willing to pay to get there. And if you believe in those things, or you can believe in different things, but downstream of those beliefs, you're going to do different things and you have different outcomes. What probably is not the thing that will get you there is, I could tell you about the meetings we had around brainstorming and who we try to hire, but I've worked in other companies and we certainly didn't do any time locked swag or, how the website. You can have people in your company who are capable of doing this, but what is going to actually result in whether it happens or not is like what you believe as a company, what you value, what is the purpose of what you're doing? What are you willing to trade off to get these outcomes? And many companies aren't willing to do that.
Talk about the actual conversations and the meetings you had, like with the design team. But take maybe to the website, because that's a more common case. Not everyone's going to be producing custom logo bomber jackets and stuff. I've worked with a lot of people who've hired really exceptional design talent, but then still wind up with very mediocre outcomes. And I've gotten to the point now where whenever I work with a designer, like the first meeting I have with them is I have to be like, listen, I need you to unlearn all the trauma from all the past meetings you've had where somebody like made you compromise your vision. I only want you to do something that's going to be, you're so proud of it that it's going to be the first thing in your portfolio from now on. So like, what do I have to do to unlock that level of creativity? And we try, then we have that conversation. They'll often be like, oh, well, the stuff I want to do is always too wacky. And I'm like, great. Picture me the wackiest thing you could possibly think of, whatever you actually genuinely care about. And I could just tell that you got that level of performance out of, out of your whole team that worked on those things. So just, what were those meetings like? What tips and tricks can you give people for like, if you want to unlock that creativity in talented people, how do you do it?
To be really transparent, like it just probably one of the biggest things is we just took way more time on it. I think from branding until launch, it was a 6-month process. That included the new brand and the website, which is like way longer than reform.
Oh, most people do not have the patience for that.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, no, we kind of were just torturous. And I think it was downstream to values. Like we had a value of raising the bar and we would talk about it in his meeting. Actually, we didn't have a value of raising the bar. We had the value, except we didn't write it down at the time. It was like a year before we refreshed it, but we would just say that again and again. This is like what we value. And we said, what does it mean? We had explained, what this means. Like linear raised the bar because linear pushed forward what the state of our design, and it became a trend. And we want to push it forward. We don't want to be a follower. We think like that is something we owe to the world. Like, how can we push this forward, expand what people think is possible and or interesting to do in this space? And we also spend a lot of time just offloading context and beliefs. This idea that we are a consumer product. Like, we want to be product forward. We want to be different for different sake, but because we are different. Why we want to do the opposite of stock photos of people in offices instead of the product, because we are a product company and the product is something that people use. And we want to combine all of that with raising the bar for design. And so those are like the big pillars that we make sure we're in there. And we just kind of wouldn't stop bothering them until it was that.
Just to be concrete about it. So you spent 6 months on this. How many different like top level designs did you go through? Like, was it like you spent 5 of the 6 months iterating on different designs and you picked the one and then you dialed it in? Or was it like, no, after a month or two, you had the kind of the general scheme and concept of the brand and you spent those months like just dialing it in?
Yeah. So I believe it was something like 2 to 3 months on the brand and the design language under brand, and probably another 2 months ish on the design. And I'm counting development too, and the development's about 2 months.
Of course.
So all in around 6 months.
Okay, you got time for a lightning round of just a couple quick ones?
Sure, let's do it.
Yeah. All right, let's do it. You can give as long or short answers to these as you like. One of my favorite things when preparing for these interviews is like come across all these cool things you said over the years, and I'm like, I got to make sure I ask about that. Okay, this one I really appreciate you saying this one because you've been really honest about this. You said, after running 3 companies and now on my 4th, I still have imposter syndrome. And I was like, oh man, me too. Talk about that.
I described this to my coach as feeling like an individual contributor in a CEO, founder, leader's body for this longest time. And I'm still like trying to process why I do that. But on some level, what I suspect is like some kind of defense mechanism where, hey, look at how cool the things I'm doing right now are. And because I'm not really this person, if it doesn't work out, it's not a big deal. I still I'm doing it. And that is not an effective mentality to have when you're running a company. You actually do have to be that person. You have to forgive yourself that it's okay to be that person. I have these conversations with people. It's like, look at what you're doing. It's amazing. And I'm a fan of what you've done, which I still struggle with. I struggle with a lot more before because I'm like, okay, I literally haven't done anything. And it's equivalent of this should be obvious, right? And, the fact it's not obvious to you, this is so simple. One of the breakthroughs I had is understanding that one of the things that has taken a lot of time to learn has been really impactful is unconsciously, I just think everyone is like me. I think many people probably think the same. And the most impactful thing to experience is discovering over and over and over again how untrue that is, and how that is not a good default assumption.
Definitely not. You talk a lot about how work-life balance is overrated and that work is a part of life and life is a part of work. But you don't strike me as the workaholic type either. So explain what you mean by that.
I don't know. I think my wife would probably disagree with that characterization. But what I mean is humans, we develop skills and we do productive work, and that's what's created society and culture. And this idea that I think it's fairly new that work is not a part of that, I think does a disservice to what does it mean to be a human being? When you think about the humans that we celebrate, these are people who have done great work that is memorable. And so I think an integral part of life is doing that great work. So I reject this idea that these are zero-sum things in the same way I reject lean startup as a zero-sum thing, right? It should be integrated. It's part of, if you want to do successful work, you have to take care of yourself. And if you take care of yourself, you can do more successful work.
Helps if you're trying to build a purpose-driven life and you do purpose-driven work.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. You said that I think in an interview somewhere, you said that when you were a kid, your dad gave you a copy of Richard Feynman's book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman.
Yeah.
Did that have a big influence on you? I love that book and I rarely get to talk about it with anybody. So
I
saw that there. I got to ask you about it. Why is that book so great? Why do you like
it? It was surprising. Here's this really successful physicist, and this idea that someone can think so unconventionally and be so successful, and probably was successful because of that, struck a nerve with me because I saw myself in that book as a child, right? There's so many things that people do, and it kind of just doesn't make sense. And here's a person who it also doesn't make sense to, and you feel kind of seen, right? And this person who's taking off the mask of a lot of affectations that people have. The most memorable is vignette. There's so many good vignettes in that book, but one of the more memorable ones is when he was bird watching with his dad, and his dad says what's that bird? And he says the name of the bird, but that's you have no idea what that bird is. The bird is what it eats, when it wakes up, where it goes. That's when you know a bird. But a lot of people know the name of the bird. They don't know anything about the bird. I was like, wow, that makes sense. There's a difference between knowing a thing and knowing a thing.
All right. I think this is a good one to end on because I just feel like it encapsulates so much of what you're all about. You said you can be technical, you could be not technical, you could be analytical, you could be not analytical. The most important thing, no matter what you're good at, is to build stuff. Why?
For me, it's the best way to learn. I talk to a lot of founders, and I know you meet a lot who want to be founders. A lot of people want to be founders, and they think, well, first I have to do X to prepare. I need to be technical. I need to be analytical. But the best way to learn, I think, is to do it. And there's actually no replacing the doing of it. You can learn a lot by reading, but the experience of it and the depth of knowing it is going to be completely different when you're in the seat and there's a million other things going on. So it's like you can read as much about basketball as you possibly can, but if you're not playing basketball, you're not going to get good at basketball. So that's what I mean by just build. It's the equivalent of get started and do something.
Well, amen to that. Siqi, thanks for taking time. Thanks for all the things that you've been building over the years that have impacted a lot of our lives in positive ways. And thanks for being so open and honest about, what it's really like to be a builder and to try to create things in the world. It's not always easy. It's not always fun, but there is a reward to it. So really
thanks for having me. I really enjoy this.
You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.